In this video, we're going to be discussing how to establish a world building concept, how to set goals for the world building process, as well as why setting those concepts and goals are important to begin with. Hey everyone, my name is Matthew, at least that's what I've planned for you to believe, and this video is the first in a series where I'll be going through the world building process step by step, starting from nothing and building a fictional world that could be used for something like a novel or a tabletop role-playing campaign. My aim is to create something along the way, explaining everything as I go so that the process is nice and easy to follow. But before we can build anything, it's important to set out goals for what we want to world build, kind of like a session zero, to set out things clearly before we start. In this video, we'll be discussing world building concepts, which are the main foundational elements for world building that we will build everything else on top of. Here we'll ask questions like, is your fictional world going to be fantasy focused or have elements of sci-fi? Is it going to be close to Earth-like or be completely different and unique? These decisions give a lot of scope for all the subsequent decisions you're likely to make for your world. So, without further ado, welcome to the World Building Corner. Alright, let's do this. The very first step we have to take in world building is to have a concept in mind. A concept in storytelling or world building terms is what defines your world at its most basic level. It's the core idea of everything you'll be creating. These concepts might be something very general, like a romance between two friends, or something more specific, like the chosen one runs away as a child and then comes to terms with the facts that they must save the world. There are no rules for what makes something a good concept, but for world building, general concepts allow for more creative freedom, and specific concepts are more constrained. The only world building requirement for a romance between two friends is that two people exist. This concept fits into just about any setting, from a romance novel all the way through to gritty horror. However, the lack of constraints can also be paralyzing when it comes to starting the world building process, and it can make that process harder to begin with. It's a little bit like asking yourself to just draw the rest of the owl. To address this, if you're only working with a general concept, try to layer multiple general concepts on top of each other, and you'll start to see a more complete picture of what world you're building. For example, if we establish 5 general concepts like a romance between two friends, an off-world human colony, cool swords, speculative evolution, and let's say a catastrophic natural disaster, this now gives us a much clearer picture and direction to go with for world building. There are two friends in an off-world human colony, which clearly establishes that the people in the world are spacefaring, so we're going to need to world build an advanced civilization. Cool swords for spacefaring civilizations are easy to implement, and there are plenty of awesome fictional examples to draw inspiration from, like lightsabers from Star Wars to energy swords from Halo. You might even look at historical examples and tech them up, like a futuristic greatsword. Then, speculative evolution means that the creatures present are going to be different from Earth. So maybe our off-world human colony takes place on a moon of Jupiter that's been artificially engineered to be suitable not only for human life, but to provide a unique branch of evolution for many of Earth's creatures. And then finally, there's going to be a catastrophic natural disaster. So maybe that engineering we were talking about wasn't done perfectly, and the atmosphere is rapidly burning through its oxygen, threatening to kill all the oxygen-breathing inhabitants. This includes our two friends, who in what might be their final moments realize that they've always loved each other, and now that they aren't sure whether they'll survive, it feels like the perfect time to say it. this sounds like a much more interesting world to world build for. Now, of course, what concepts you choose for your world is up to you, but for this series, I'll be world building as we go along together to showcase all the strategies I use along the way. For the world we'll be making together, I want it to be a world that is recognizably Earth-like. I want it to be fantasy-based. I'd like it to include mythology. I want to make things as science-based as possible with planet making, speculative evolution, constructed languages, the whole works. And finally, I want to have multiple intelligent creatures. So, with these concepts in mind, we've outlined a world-building process that we can stick to moving forward. Let's go through each of these points, starting with wanting the world to be recognizably Earth-like. This is important because the further worlds deviate away from Earth, the harder they are to follow. Consider a world that's inhabited by creatures that look and feel like humans, that might have different cultures overall, but are still relatable to us as human readers and viewers. Creatures like elves or dwarves or even catfolk and wolfkin are easily recognizable, and so we can more readily connect with their stories and emotions. There's a reason that most fantasy works use anthropomorphized creatures, and it's not just to be weird. It's that we connect more with this than we do with this. Compare a non-human creature like Legolas to a non-human creature like Shelob. Most readers and viewers easily connect with a creature like Legolas despite him not being human, while the most character development and emotional connection that Shelob got in any of her portrayals was in the video game Shadow of War, where she's portrayed in human form. The point is, if you're wanting people to develop meaningful connection to the species you create, and therefore the world you create, then making them more human and the world more Earth-like is definitely a good decision. Next, we mentioned that we're going to be creating something fantasy-based. Fantasy is the genre devoted to exploring impossible or improbable things, such as magic, and is often inspired by mythology and folklore. By its very definition, world building usually trends towards fantasy, because most world builders don't want to just create an exact copy of Earth. Instead, we're wanting to explore what could be, to make things more interesting and capturing for those who are experiencing the worlds we're creating. Specifically, I want to create a world that has some iteration of magic, and that includes fantasy creatures. Which brings us neatly into point number 3, wanting to include mythology. Mythology is an excellent pairing of our first 2 points, bringing together things that are recognizably Earth-like and fantasy-based, because mythological creatures are already well recognizable by most people. The number of mythological elements we have on Earth is very extensive, and so I don't think we'll be able to include everything. But I'd like to include a mix of classic favorites like zombies and dragons being my favorite mythological creature of all, whilst also exploring some more niche mythology that's less well known. And as an Australian, I'd be remiss if I didn't try to include some Australian folklore as well. Stay tuned for drop bears. Next up, we have science-based world building, which is a huge point for me and probably going to be one of the keystones of the series moving forward. As best as I can within a fictional fantasy universe, I want to world build things that make sense. From the physics of planet making, to the biology of speculative evolution, to the sociology of cultural development. An important factor for here is that making things that make sense within the bounds of real-world science means that it can be used by anyone, in just about any setting. The idea of making something work, at least on some scientific level, is an aspect of world building that I personally find fascinating, and I believe it makes the entire process more interesting. Now, I'm not a scientist, and I assume many of you won't be as well, but the great news is that for world building, that's completely fine. We are, after all, creating a fictional world, and at some point in all fiction, we'll have to deviate from reality. But for this series, we'll make things as true to science as possible, meaning that we'll only deviate from reality when it makes sense, and when it's going to make things cooler. Finally, I want there to be several different creatures that will world build to evolve intelligence, so that we can continue their journey past their biological evolution and into their social and technological evolution, starting from the Stone Age and ending, well, who knows where. While world building stars and biomes and languages is fascinating, it's the culture and societies that are present in stories and games that I really connect with. And I feel like that's what most others connect with as well. So, to recap, establishing the main concepts you want for your world building is important before you start. If you're using general concepts, try to come up with a few that you can tie together to get a better view of what you want to create. For the world we'll build together throughout this series, we'll create an Earth-like fantasy science fiction world with elements of mythology, scientific justification, and intelligent societies. Join me next time where we'll start the world building process proper, establishing some fundamental rules for the universe itself. You can find all the information for this video and other resources for world building in general over at worldbuildingcorner.com. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to follow the world building journey. And until next time, stay awesome.